On behalf of the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, we'd like to welcome all of you here for a conference today on World or Peace in the Middle East, QUO VADIS, Same Challenges or New Directions. We are gathered here today with our administrator is Professor Yona Alexander, who's going to chair this program and moderate, and Professor Don Wallace will provide the opening remarks. We are going to accept questions and answers. We ask that the participants provide those through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will address all of the questions and answers, as many as we can get to, at the conclusion of the presentations of each speaker. So with that, Yona, I would like to pass the program off to you. I will turn off my camera, but I will be available as you need me. Okay?
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to this program, most recent in a long series of programs that the ILI has done with Yona. You know, we hear a great deal about pivoting to Asia, and that normally means pivoting away from the Middle East, but there doesn't seem to be an escape. Yona says his program is going to deal with peacemaking, and of course that raises the question, peace about what? Are we talking about the Palestinians and Israel? Are we talking about Iran? Are we talking about Yemen? Are we talking about Afghanistan? Well, for the answer to that question, I'd like to turn the program over to Yona.
Thank you very much, Don. You always put your finger on the most important issues. If we would know the answers, I'm sure we wouldn't have this discussion today. At any rate, many, many thanks to you personally for many years of cooperation, support, and guidance. And we owe really gratitude, as you know, to our colleagues, academics, and partners in the US and internationally, the Middle East. Particularly, you spent also some years there. And I have a few decades to count as well. At any rate, I think we should have a interesting, productive discussion today. I would like to, of course, welcome our distinguished panel speakers and commentators. I will introduce them according to their list on the program in a while. Obviously, we have to also welcome invited colleagues and friends, attendees in the United States and abroad. As Bob indicated, if they do have some questions, they can submit it in writing. We'll try to respond. Last but not least, I would like to welcome our interns, graduate, undergraduate, and some law students in the United States and abroad. And we're delighted to have them, and we're doing what we can to, I think, train the so-called next generation of professionals, experts, scholars, and so on. So we do have the program. I don't know if it is on the screen. At this time, I just would welcome very briefly our speakers, Ambassador retired Jerry Firestein, who is a senior vice president, Middle East Institute. I will, by the way, introduce each one with some background information later on, but at this point, we would like to welcome him. The other one, of course, is Dr. David Pollack, who is a Bernstein Fellow at the Washington Institute. The third is Dr. Wayne Zaveman, a retired special agent and legal attaché of the FBI in the Middle East and elsewhere. Dr. Mir Sadat, who is the former director of the U.S. National Security Council, and our colleagues and commentators, Dr. Nicholas Rostow, a senior research scholar at Yale Law School, and also as an attorney involved in legal work, and Dr. Ford Rowan, who is currently chairman of the National Center for Critical Incident Analysis. We will come back to them, but I think just a note of the format, as we mentioned before, I think after the speakers will make a initial presentation, the commentators will join, we will develop a so-called, I say so-called question and answer session, and invite the attendees, invite the interns and others. And this virtual event is not broadcast live at this point. It is being recorded, as you know, and the video would be available for others to view, and we're planning to publish also a report. Now, I just want to mention for clarity and transparency that the title that we have for this program about the QUO VADIS, nothing is new. In fact, going all the way back the year 2000, so before 9/11, we had an event. I think that some of us quite remember the Middle East peace process, QUO VADIS. We asked that question at that time as well, and obviously we asked some other questions in regard to some of the terrorist groups operating, like Hezbollah and so on, before even 9/11. Now, before I introduce again the speakers, I would like to just make two or three footnotes, very quick footnotes related to the context, I think, of the forum, again, for some clarity, what we're going to discuss. I believe that the way we can deal with that short, I think, discussion is, number one, to look, obviously, at the historical and contemporary perspective, obviously not to go all the way back to antiquity and Middle Ages and the modern roots of the issues related to the Middle East, but basically to try to focus on the experiences and lessons since 9/11, the 20th, I think the 20 years anniversary and so on, and maybe consider some future prospects of war and peace within the region and beyond the region, which brings me to the geographic, I think, perspective that we have to keep in mind all the time, not only to focus on the regional aspect, the so-called traditional Arab, non-Arab in the Middle East, but to move, obviously, for practical reasons, to the interregional or globalization, if you will, the broader view, which is really relevant, I think, to the impact of the Middle East on other regions, as well as the implications of health security concerns in the region elsewhere. So the bottom line is basically the two critical questions. Is the worst yet to come in terms of health security challenges? And our societies are able or planning to deal effectively with future threats. So I think fundamentally, these are the issues. We have a map, I think I see on the screen, which I think illustrates the connection between the different geographic regions. When we discuss, for example, the issues related to Africa and North Africa and the Sahel and so on, we can also consider the threats, the security threats from the Atlantic to the Red Sea and beyond the Indian Ocean and so forth, and those who are active in that particular region. So I really believe that we have to see the broader picture when we discuss the Middle East issues. Now, I would like to move on. Are there any other slides that we want to? Yeah, well, basically, very quickly, we try to deal, however modestly, with many of the issues. These are some of the issues that we dealt with the past couple years, and also to examine what role is, for example, to legal systems and approaches to deal with the problem, and also the role of diplomacy in world affairs. Next. Okay, I think that we're ready to move on to our distinguished panel, and I would like to first introduce our speaker according to the program. As you can see, Ambassador Gerald Feuerstein. It needs no introduction, if I may say so, because number one of his work, the State Department as diplomat, but also academically, we welcome him again at the ILI, and we had the honor to host him at the time. So his background is quite known, over 40 years of service. He served not only in the high positions of the State Department, but also abroad, overseas, I think some 9 different countries and locations, all the way from Saudi Arabia and Oman and Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia, and elsewhere. And as a coordinator at the State Department Counterterrorism Bureau, I remember his many contributions to our knowledge, practical approaches. And once he retired from government work, he joined the Middle East Institute, I think in 2016. And then the board of the Middle East Institute named him as senior vice president and director of the Institute Policy Center. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to take over?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yona, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to spend a little bit of time talking about this issue that you have put on the table for us. I must say that, of course, you asked if I would say a few words about the situation in North Africa and also in the Gulf and Yemen, the 2 extremes, the western and the eastern ends of what we typically consider to be the Middle East, and you know, very disparate in terms of where they are and the direction that they're moving in. And so where we are, I mean, the questions that you've asked are incredibly complex, difficult to respond to. And in fact, you know, in looking at it, there are 2 distinct questions that you put on the table. One is the region currently at the brink of unprecedented disaster. I would say the answer to that is yes. And then the second question is, are we beginning to build new peacemaking processes? And I would say that the answer to that question is also yes. So I think that, you know, I think that we're at a very early stage. And let me just go through what I think are the key factors that lead to both of those responses. In terms of why do we think that we're on the brink of unprecedented disaster, I would say that there are a few issues out there that we need to look at in not necessarily any particular order, but you know, beginning with the North Africa side, you know, first of all, you have the continuation of extremism and terrorism that is coming out of the Sahel, particularly not only AQIM, which you identify, but some of the splinter organizations that have spun off from AQIM in Mali, Niger, Chad, and elsewhere that are also continuing to destabilize the situations in the Maghreb, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and even to a certain extent in Morocco. So we have still that fundamental issue that we have not resolved this issue of terrorism, and in some ways, what we have seen over the past couple of years is really a resurgence of these extremist organizations. And I'll talk for a moment a little bit later about what I see as critical feeders for that extremism.
If I could interrupt for a second and just ask that the map be put back up, because I think it would be helpful for our audience to see the map again.
There we go. It's not a pretty map, actually. The other aspect that's related to that is the continuation of political instability, particularly in Algeria, owing to an inability for the Algerians to really move forward on a political transition out of the Bouteflika era into something that is going to provide a way forward for the Algerians. And while things are quiet at the moment, nevertheless, those are unresolved issues. And then the other key question is political stability in Tunisia, where we're going forward. Tunisia, as we all know, was a bright spot in terms of the Arab Spring, in terms of their ability to work out a peaceful political transition to a more democratic, more open society, all very positive. And yet they continue to be buffeted by a number of the winds that are blowing through the region, not only the rise of extremism, but also some of the other factors that are out there. And again, we'll talk about some of those in a moment. So you have the continuation of political instability in these countries that is feeding into the broader instability and extremism. Then we also have, moving farther to the east, the continued stalemate in Yemen. And despite the efforts of the Biden administration to really use the weight of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. engagement as a way of moving the Yemen conflict into a more political situation, accomplishing a ceasefire in support of the United Nations-led negotiations there, trying to get that country beyond the current conflict. That has not moved ahead yet, and we're continuing to see, in fact, not only is it not moving forward, but an expansion of military operations, particularly in northern Yemen, with spillover effects into Saudi Arabia and more broadly in the Arabian Peninsula. And another factor that's there, as we're looking at the potential negative consequences of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the possibility that AQ senior leadership will be able to reestablish its foothold in Afghanistan, perhaps also with the arrival of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. That could also have implications for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has been diminished over these years of civil conflict, and yet could come back. And that, of course, would be extremely destabilizing, not only in the region, but potentially globally. So this is also something that that should be watched. And then we have also the fact that we're uncertain right now about what direction Iran is going to move in once Mr. Raisi takes over as the president, and what are the implications going to be for regional security and stability. Again, there was hope, I think, at the outset of the Biden administration that by reestablishing a dialogue between the U.S. and Iran, hopefully returning the United States to participation in the JCPOA, with, of course, also Iranian return to full implementation of its responsibilities in the JCPOA, that this might have a positive impact on several of the regional conflicts that are going on, particularly in Yemen, but also, of course, more broadly in Syria, and now potentially in Afghanistan as well. So we don't know what kind of a direction Mr. Raisi is going to push Iran, and whether that's going to be a stabilizing or destabilizing aspect. And then just to kind of wrap up why I think that that we are looking at a very potentially disastrous situation in the region. There are two global issues that are out there. One is, again, the continued decline, at least in the perception that regional powers have, of the role of the United States, of the U.S. commitment to remain engaged on security and defense issues, as well as the broader political challenges in the region, and that has invited the resurgence of great power competition in the Middle East. And so we see the Chinese playing a more assertive role. Potentially their links to Iran could have serious implications in terms of regional security and stability. The role that they're playing, establishing themselves in the Red Sea, again, as a potential destabilizer in the Horn of Africa and across the way in the Arabian Peninsula. And then also at least the nominal efforts that Russia is making also to reestablish itself in the Red Sea, establishing a military agreement with Sudan that will allow it to base out of ports in Sudan, that could introduce, again, another element of great power competition into the Middle East. So that's one global factor. And then the other key factor is, of course, some of the cross-cutting issues that we're looking at. And if you want to look at the destabilizing elements in Tunisia, for example, the impact of the global pandemic of COVID-19 continues to be a potential destabilizer. It continues to feed into issues of extremism in Tunisia, the inability of the government to deal with the pandemic. They're going through another major outbreak of it right now, and that has created tensions that raise doubts about the success of this democratic transition in Tunisia. It's having other elements as well. And then you look more broadly at some of these other issues of climate and environment that are going to become bigger factors in the region over the coming years. And again, these are potentially sources of major instability and of conflict in the region. So those are the issues that I think are critical in terms of why I think that potentially we're on the brink of disaster. But then I look at the other direction, and what are the issues that I see out there that are more reassuring and more positive about how I see the region moving. And those factors I would include as Libya, which has made major progress in resolving its conflict over the past several months, is now on a much more positive trajectory, getting away from the threat of the overall collapse of Libya as a unified state. And we've now come together. We have a process in place that conceivably is going to lead to elections later this year for parliament, for president, implementation of their new constitution, a number of positive developments on the Libya side that I think were not anticipated really until very recently. And so that's one positive development. I would also say that even though Iran is a bit of a wild card and potentially playing into instability in the region, by the same token, I would say that the fact that the US and Iran are engaged in discussions in Vienna, as well as the fact that the Saudis and the UAE are also opening channels of communication with Iran, even though those are still at a low level, but nevertheless, the fact that they're talking is an important step. It reduces tensions in the region, potentially can help pave the way for not only a return to the Iran nuclear deal, but also to address some of the other issues, again, especially Yemen, but potentially elsewhere, that have been sources of tension in the region and therefore a positive development. I would also say that as part of that, what we've seen over the course of this year is the repairing of the rifts within the GCC, the fact that Qatar is to a great extent incorporated into the GCC, that many of the tensions that were creating difficulties in the US pushing forward on mutual issues of security and defense and other kinds of cooperation have been more or less, if not resolved, at least put aside for the time being. And that has helped to improve the environment for cooperation among the moderate states of the region. Again, a positive thing. And then the last point that I would make on that side are the Abraham Accords. And I assume that we'll hear more about that from the other speakers. But again, the Abraham Accords being a positive step forward in terms of reducing tensions, opening up channels of communication, and ways that are important in perhaps opening the door to the resolution of some of the longstanding issues, at least an improved dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as opening the potential for broad economic, political, and other kinds of cooperation between Israel and the states of the Gulf and elsewhere in the region. And so again, just to wrap up, I would say that it's far too early to answer, the fundamental question, where are we headed? It's too early to say. The good news is that I think that at least on the part of many of the governments in the region, as well as the United States, there is a desire and an interest and a capacity to move forward to begin to address some of these longstanding issues and improve security. And yet we're far from there. And again, I would stress the point that that beyond just these political issues that generally are the focus of these kinds of conversations, the fact is that as we're looking at still the fallout of the global pandemic, with the potential of other public health crises to come, of some of the other issues related to climate change, to environment. You can look at the water riots in Iran right now as being another aspect, another attribute of the potential impact of climate on regional stability, as well as issues related to economics, demographics, and many of the others, food security. These are issues that are going to continue to pose threats to regional stability unless the societies in the region, as well as the international community, can take steps to begin to address them. And let me stop there.
Thank you very much for this overview, which is very helpful, I think, as a beginning of our discussion with other panelists. Of course, we'll come back to all the points that you made. And for example, the insight that you provided related to the peace processes that are going on. And now the Israel-Palestinian relations, we would like to move on in the interest of time to Dr. David Park from the Washington Institute. Again, he needs no introduction here related to his important work at the Washington Institute and the State Department. I just would mention one of his major projects, project, which is a program related to generating policy ideas, promoting positive change, and the spread, against the spread of extremism in the Middle East. And also in terms of his broader, I think, contributions at the State Department over the years. And he can discuss those related to democracy promotion and women's rights and so on and so forth. So I think this opportunity that we have David again, he spoke at our events before this year related to the COVID issues. So I would like to welcome him now again and to deal with some of the issues that concerns him and us.
Thank you so much, Yona, and thank you, Don, for hosting and organizing this event, and thanks to all of my fellow panelists and our audience for being with us today. I have to start out just by mentioning the obvious fact that we are approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11 very soon, and I can't help but be reminded that 20 years ago, in May of 2001, when I was serving on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, I wrote a memo to the Secretary that was 4 months before 9/11 that started out with this line, which was subsequently declassified. Quote, "The United States can no longer live with Taliban support for terrorism." Unquote. Of course, that memo was ignored because people at the time, or partly because I guess people at the time felt that the most important immediate Middle East issue was not Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or terrorism or Afghanistan, but the second Intifada, which was then underway, just getting underway between Israelis and Palestinians. And that leads me to start off this discussion, or my little segment of this discussion, by just saying this. What I've learned over the last 20 years from that incident and many others is that the issue that I agreed to talk about today, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is not necessarily the most important issue in the region, and not necessarily the one that has the most direct or urgent impact on American interests in the region, despite the very heavy media coverage and other kinds of attention that it tends to get. Having said that, that is what I'm going to talk about, and because it's still an important issue, and it is one that is poised somewhere in between war and peace, much like Ambassador Firestein pointed out, many other aspects of regional geopolitics these days. And I want to just very briefly talk about what I think are 4 new things and one old thing about the Israeli-Palestinian arena right now and going forward in the foreseeable future. And then what conclusion that brings me to about this particular issue these days. So one thing that's new is a new Israeli government. And there are several features, and I'm going to be extremely telegraphic just to save time and welcome any comments or questions later. One thing that's different about this Israeli government that was put together just in the last several weeks is that for the first time in Israel's history, it includes a truly independent Arab political party as part of the governing coalition. And that, I think, is significant, not so much because of any impact that it might have on foreign policy or on American interests per se, but as evidence about the nature of Israeli democracy. It's a very imperfect democracy. It does not extend to the occupied territories, but within the borders, the internationally recognized borders of Israel, it is a democracy that actually has moved toward greater inclusivity, not toward apartheid or some of the other things that Ben and Jerry's and other people are talking about lately. So that's number one. Number two, and I think that actually that helps to explain the continued American political and security support for Israel. Number two, this is the first Israeli government in over a decade without Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that's also a significant change. And I think it opens up potential for greater avenues of dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and some segments of American society and of the American government, and also between Israel and other actors in the region, even perhaps when it comes to, for example, to take an immediate contentious issue, the Iran nuclear deal. I think we are very unlikely to see the same kind of direct public confrontation between this Israeli government and the US government, whatever the future of the JCPOA or of American policy toward Iran. But despite those two, in my mind at least, quite positive changes, it's also a government that is probably the most internally divided ever in Israeli politics, and that's really saying something. This is a government that includes elements of the pretty far right, elements of the pretty far left, and a scattering of other parties with unclear policies on some of the major issues in the center at the top positions in the new Israeli government. So it's not very clear, actually, and I don't think it will ever be clear. This is not a matter of waiting for the dust to settle. I don't think that this government will ever have a very clear or unified policy direction on the Palestinian issue in particular. And so I will move on from that to what's new in American policy toward Israel and the Palestinians. Well, there's a lot that's different, obviously, in this administration from the Trump administration or others. And so let me just mention briefly three things that I think are new and important here. One is there is already much greater American diplomatic and economic and humanitarian outreach to the Palestinians in just the first half year of the Biden administration than there ever was under Donald Trump, who is moving in a very opposite direction on that issue. Secondly, at the same time, this administration has come out very clearly and strongly in support of the traditional US alliance with Israel. And that is perhaps to some people something of a surprise, given some of the statements from some of the so-called progressives inside the Democratic Party and others. Third, I think maybe this is the key point operationally. The administration, as I see it, has recognized, unlike its immediate predecessor and the Obama administration before it and many, many others, that there is simply no prospect of a final status agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the policy relevant future. And therefore, the approach that the United States should take is one of incremental, practical steps to improve conditions that might someday open the door to that kind of settlement, a two-state solution, but far in the future. And that's a very important and I think realistic change in American policy. What else is new? Number 3, Hamas. Hamas is new in the sense, of course, it's been around. It took over Gaza by force in 2007. So, and it's been around as a officially designated terrorist movement for even longer than that. So that's not new in and of itself. But what's new is the behavior of Hamas under its new leader, Yahya Sinwar, in Gaza. For the first time in well over 7 years, Hamas decided to initiate armed hostilities against Israel just a few weeks ago in late or mid-May. And there is some concern among Israeli analysts, although they aren't talking very much about it very publicly, that this might represent a new phase in Hamas behavior, much more aggressive, self-confident perhaps, and dangerous phase in which Hamas will be tempted to renew hostilities against Israel every now and then, rather than existing in a state mostly of deterrence. That's one thing that's new, although we're not sure, at least I'm not sure, about exactly how that's going to play out. A second thing that's new is that Hamas is now in a rather different position when it comes to its international allies. I think that there is a sense in the region, and I see this reflected not just at the government level, but also at the popular level in public opinion polls that I run around the region every several months, that while Hamas is a factor in the equation and cannot be ignored, it is not one that is deserving of Arab or international support. And I think that this sense of reality, not just a sense of greater isolation from some of its earlier allies, whether in Qatar or in Turkey or in Iran, and greater Arab pressure against Hamas adventurism on the part of Egypt and others, may have a calming effect on what would otherwise be, as I just mentioned, a temptation for Hamas to renew hostilities. And finally, I want to point to the internal crisis of legitimacy that Hamas faces. It's not as if there's ever going to be, in any foreseeable future, an election that might vote Hamas out of power. It's not as if there's going to be a popular uprising against Hamas in Gaza. But every indication that we have, that I have, is that this attempt to increase its popularity and legitimacy by sending rockets and missiles into Israel has a very, very short-lived effect. Arab public opinion in general, and even Palestinian public opinion in general, are not supportive of Hamas. Not before the conflict in May and not afterwards. And because this is not a democracy that has only indirect effects on Hamas behavior and on the geopolitics of this question, but I think it does act as a restraining factor. So I would say, taking all of these factors together, that the likelihood of a major conflagration, again, in Gaza, is actually quite low. Another new factor that was already mentioned by Ambassador Firestein is normalization between Israel. And it's not just the UAE and Bahrain, it's also Morocco and Sudan. And this is extending, at least in less formal ways, to many other countries in the region. Just today, for example, there was a report that Israel was admitted as an observer to the African Union, of all things. And we can see signs of greater cooperation, sometimes in not very savory ways, as with the NSO spyware issue between Israel and other Arab states like Saudi Arabia, with whom it does not have any formal diplomatic relations. This is a very important new factor. And I want to say just, again, 3 very quick things about it, very quick. One is that the Biden administration supports this strongly, even though it was a Trump administration initiative and a Trump administration success. By every indication, whether it's arms sales to the UAE, continued recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, and its diplomatic and economic policies towards Sudan and other countries, and its diplomatic declarations, the Biden administration strongly supports this process, and that's important and I think positive. Number 2, normalization has a great deal of popular acceptance among the Arab publics that are most directly affected. It's not majority support. I have to say that, to be clear, but there is a solid core of about 40%, according to a poll that I just did in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, that will be published in the next few days. So I'm giving you a bit of a sort of a scoop here. There is a solid core of about 40% of the public, not just the government or the elites, who support normalization with Israel. And that is in the immediate aftermath of the Gaza mini-war, when many people were wondering whether normalization would survive that test, especially at the popular level. So that's also important and I think positive. Number 3 is much less clear, and that is, can normalization between Israel and some of these Arab countries help the Palestinians in any way? Can it be a bridge, not a bypass road, as my colleague David Makovsky at the Washington Institute often puts it, toward progress on the Palestinian issue? I think the answer to that is not at all clear. And unfortunately, it may just be the case that as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, this is not going to be a positive contribution, but rather perhaps a source of anger and frustration and disappointment in the end. Okay, now what's old? There's only one thing that I want to mention that's old, and that's Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership, the entire leadership of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And that's why, one more reason why, the prospect of any fundamental changes toward a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians are very remote. Abbas, I think, is interested, yes, and has already made personal contact with the leaders of the new Israeli government and of the Biden administration. Again, something quite different from anything that we saw in the previous 4 years. But that doesn't mean that he's interested in any significant concessions or any real give and take on issues of peace with Israel. In fact, the evidence so far is that the PA has presented, at least according to the leaks that I've seen, a list of 33 demands to the Israelis to even renew formal negotiations. And it's basically the same old stuff without, and this is the key point, I don't mind so much if they just repeat the same old demands, but my question is, well, what are you offering in return? And the answer so far basically is nothing. So I have to conclude that this not new, this actually very old and worn out factor on the Palestinian side of the equation is one that points in the direction of continued stalemate. Where does that all leave us? I think it leaves us in a, my prognosis at least, facing the prospect of what many years ago Gamal Abdel Nasser used to call the crime of no war, no peace. Meaning that we're probably not going to see, I don't think, a major outbreak of fighting between Israel and anybody on its borders or away from its borders in the foreseeable future. But I don't think we're going to see any significant progress on peacemaking between Israel and the Palestinians either. And so probably the best that we can all hope for, and not just hope for, but work for, is to, and I do think that this is where American policy is heading, is to work on, as I said at the outset, incremental, practical steps that would keep the door open for peace at some point in the distant future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your analysis, the interconnections, and basically looking continuity of the same challenges we had. Maybe some go back to 100 years, so the First World War. At any rate, maybe some change, and we'll see what our colleagues on the panel are going to offer in this regard. But we want to thank you very much for raising some very important issues. And clearly we can go back to some of the views from Israel and elsewhere related to a confrontation that you mentioned in regard to Gaza. And particularly, you referred to Yahya Sinwar, work there in leadership and the tunnel concerns and all that, but we'll see if we can get back to it a little bit later on. Again, in the interest of time, I would like to move on to our next colleague, Dr. Wayne Zaveman. Again, he, like the others, needs no introduction in Washington and in the region for his decades of work related to the Middle East as a legal attaché in the region and conducting liaison with the police and security intelligence agencies in the region and so on. And also academically, he was educated at NYU and received his doctorate there related to Iran and Iranian language and studies and so on. So we invited him to speak in relation to some of his concerns in the region. They're very broad, obviously, from the law enforcement to the issue of Iran. So Wayne, why don't you take over, please?
Thank you, Yona, and thank you to the participants today. I'm going to focus essentially on Iran as an existential threat. Iran may or may not currently possess nuclear weapons, but what is clear is that they have been and are currently enriching uranium very close to weapons grade. And they've developed missile and warhead technology. So in a sense, what they're doing is creating the, quote, parts, unquote, of a nuclear weapon without assembling it and putting the parts on the shelf for later use. So they have the enriched uranium, which they're now enriching up to 60%. They have the warhead technology, the warheads, and they have the missiles. So that's why I believe that this is a very dangerous situation. Iran practices a Shia concept called taqiyya, which allows them to profess the contrary to their true beliefs. In a sense, it's a legalized, religiously approved form of lying. And they basically are able to conduct covert nuclear weapons program while publicly stating to the contrary that they're frozen their program. Iran does not adhere to international norms. Iran has funded, trained, and supplied terrorist entities and governments. They have regional and global ambitions. For example, they've been supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi insurgents, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and currently the Houthis in Yemen. They've also been supporting President Assad's Syrian regime. They have influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Iran also has designs on Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and the Emirates. Will Iran use nuclear weapons if they have them? Well, secular terrorists are concerned about public opinion, how people view them, and they do not want to induce mass casualties. However, religiously motivated terrorists are not concerned about causing mass casualties or about public opinion. They have one audience. That audience is God, and they presume to know what God wants them to do. And when a population has allowed these people to speak on God's behalf, which happened after the 1979 revolution, they can't later criticize the actions because, in effect, they'd be criticizing God. Iran has a messianic theology. The supreme leader might cause a cataclysmic event which will hasten the coming of the hidden Imam, the Mahdi, or Messiah. Now, the current supreme leader, Khamenei, is getting older, sicker, and we don't know how long he'll be around. There's some belief that the possible successor will be Ebrahim Raisi, who's becoming the current president. He takes office next month. His nickname is the Butcher, and this is a true believer and could pose a very strong threat if he was the supreme leader, because the supreme leader cannot be questioned. He has the final word on any kind of policy. The former nuclear agreement allowed Iran to maintain uranium enrichment and did not call for the dismantling of their nuclear facilities. The soon-to-be former President Rouhani stated, excuse me, we can leave international agreements whenever we wish. So in a sense, it's the old concept of a hudna, or a temporary agreement, which can be abrogated whenever they want to abrogate it. Regarding snapback sanctions, once sanctions are lifted by the Biden administration, it'll be extremely difficult to get the genie back in the bottle. It took a long time and much work to institute those sanctions, and the countries who participated in the sanctions will not want to limit their revenue sources coming in. Not only did the Obama agreement allow Iran to enrich uranium, it also promised Iran a path to nuclear weapons at a date certain. The agreement, if I'm correct, it was made in 2015. It's now 2021. The agreement said within 10 years, Iran can legitimately become a nuclear power. And that would mean that from now until there could legitimately be a nuclear power, 4 years. After the Obama agreement was signed, the supreme leader stated, number one, no unlimited access to international inspections. The IAEA gets access to sites by permission only. Iran has 24 days to file an appeal and go before a council. No unannounced access, no surprise inspections. Iran takes the samples themselves, and no access to Iran's military bases. So in other words, where we used to say, trust but verify, here we can't trust and we cannot verify. The Obama agreement had no provisions for modifying Iran's behavior. Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. It spreads insurrections across the Middle East. And once Iran becomes a nuclear state, it will likely ignite a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. What I can't understand is why the Obama-Biden administration wanted to give Iran hegemony in the Middle East. They wanted to turn Iran into the axis of the Middle East. However, my opinion is the US cannot be a strategic military partner with Iran. Iran's goals are worlds apart from ours. Iran will export their revolution and will destabilize the world. Iran's ideology seeks to eliminate superpowers and make Shia Islam the predominant religion and political system worldwide. Iran wants to be the leader of all Muslims. There is no need for secular legislation. All is contained in the Quran. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted an Islamic republic, not a democratic republic, not a democracy. He considered democracy to be anathema to Islam. Sacrifice becomes a religious expression. The 1979 revolution had two versions, the domestic and the export. The domestic version is reactionary. Iran uses repression to consolidate the power of the regime. The export version is revolutionary, overthrow existing governments and replace them with Islamic republics. This is takfir. The Iranian leadership is prepared to sacrifice to the last drop of blood in Iran with a confrontation with the West and Israel. This attitude towards sacrifice was demonstrated during the Iran-Iraq War, where they sacrificed millions of Iranians for the sake of Islam. The Iranian leadership considered non-Shia to be subhuman, or in their own words, quote, animals, unquote. They have no hesitation to inflict mass casualties. Next month, the newly elected president, or I should say newly appointed president, because Iran does not have legitimate elections. They have a council made up of hardline clerics who determine who is eligible to run for office, and it's already decided who's going to win. So and they don't allow any opposing viewpoints for opposition candidates. So when Abraham Raisi comes in, AKA the butcher, he will come, among the work within the justice system, he was part of a death commission that oversaw the secret executions of about 7,000 political prisoners. Amnesty International claimed that Raisi is guilty of crimes against humanity. There is also talk that when the supreme leader dies, Raisi is a possible successor. Current actions by Iran, which are provocative, include suspension of the nuclear talks until Raisi comes to office. Also, the US discovered an Iranian plot to kidnap an Iranian-American journalist, Masih al-Najad, who resides in Brooklyn, and to bring her to Iran. While the US has been negotiating with Iran, Iran began enriching uranium up to 60%. Only countries making bombs are reaching the level of 60%. Raisi's selection to president is a clear indication of the supreme leader's decision to make Iranian conduct more extreme regarding foreign policy, their nuclear program, and terror. When the Iranian government deals with domestic protests, it brutally smashes it with the use of all government entities, which include the police, internal security, international intelligence service, the courts, etc. So opposition does not have much of a chance of gaining power. Basically, the Pastaran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, is about 1 million terrorists in that organization, and maybe another 10 million people who are supporters of that million. The bulk of the rest of the population does not want the government in power, would like to get it out, but they have really no chance to do that. They're not willing to make a move with a gun pointed at their forehead. The Biden administration does not seem to support the Abraham Accords, even though a previous speaker said that. They've already reneged on some of the agreements made, and the other Arab countries, like Saudi Arabia, that were considering entering the Abraham Accords are hesitating because they believe the U.S. does not have their back regarding Iran. They are reluctant to take risks to further Middle East peace and are beginning to hedge their bets. And I think that's one of the reasons why countries like Saudi Arabia open communications with Iran, because they're hedging their bets with Iran as opposed to making further peace agreements, normalization agreements. I guess I'll stop at this point, Yona. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Wayne. Obviously, you raised many questions and interpretation. We're coming back to it. In fact, the next speaker, Dr. Mir Sadat, I think is going to deal with this regional, interregional issues, also related to the U.S. Planned withdrawal from Afghanistan and what the Iranians are planning to do in this regard. At any rate, I would like to move on again in the interest of time and to encourage discussion among the speakers and the attendees and so on. So let me move on to Dr. Mir Sadat. Again, we're very pleased that we are that he was able to join us this time as a civilian. The last time when he spoke, I think it was 2019, he served in the White House, and they focused on strategic issues related to space. So we would like to welcome him again now that he's engaged in academic educational issues, the Atlantic Council. And also I would like to mention his new journal related to space, and they probably will also discuss some of these issues as well. And I think in terms of his role in the government, not only in terms of Afghanistan, South Asia, the broader Middle East issues and concerns. So I would like to invite him to deal with some of the issues that, according to his agenda, are important to discuss in terms of war and peace in the region and beyond. Mir?
Thank you, Yona. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks so much, Potomac Institute and Professor Alexander. Thank you so much for everything you do. And Professor Wallace, you guys are, I can't believe that you guys are so awesome with Zoom. It took me months. I had 7-year-olds and 5-year-olds teaching me how to use Zoom and MS Teams. So I want to first of all say everything you've heard is fake news. The world is fine and dandy. Everything is good. There's nothing going on. And if you think stuff on Earth is bad, look up. There's stuff coming down in space too. We got some major issues, and all of the people that Wayne and David and others mentioned have assets and weapons and intentions that are going beyond the terrestrial planet into space. And things travel very fast in space. And low Earth orbit, it goes at 17,000 miles an hour, and a little piece of speck can pierce 7 layers of the space shuttle wind glass. So, and one of the pans was not cracked. That's why one of our shuttles survived and did not get hurt. So, unfortunately, everything my colleagues are saying is the truth. And there is potential of all of that. And we are, every year, we are in a new operating environment, and America's will and our allies will and our partners will, whether they are in the Southern Hemisphere or in the Middle East, will be tested. I just want to put a quick disclaimer. I'm not here speaking on behalf of the government, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any organizations I'm affiliated with. And I'm a DoD official, but I'm not speaking on behalf of DoD. So Afghanistan everybody knows, had been described as sort of the great game between great powers, Tsarist Russia, colonial Britain, communist Soviet Union, and then of course the leader of the free world, the United States, and one of our greatest presidents, Ronald Reagan. A few months ago, I wrote a couple of pieces, and I said, when we talked about American engagement in Afghanistan, I said, let's make sure we don't mess up the end game. That's a Charlie Wilson quote, Congressman Charlie Wilson, the great American who helped the Afghans and helped America win the Cold War. Let's not mess up the end game in the great game. And so, another quick disclaimer, I'm an American whose parents were born in Afghanistan, dated in Afghanistan, went to college in Afghanistan, and fled Afghanistan. And we sought refuge in the United States of America. One of the best choices America made, and one of the best choices my parents made. And I'm so proud. And I've been privileged to wear our nation's cloth and deploy on behalf of our nation to war zones such as Afghanistan, my parents' homeland. But having said that, I'm also someone who has advocated for many years now reducing our footprint in Afghanistan, and getting our troops home, and preventing further expenditures that didn't need to be in Afghanistan. And I have seen some of those wastes and frauds and abuses firsthand. Filipino linguists in Afghanistan, there are no Filipino, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, had been there for 4 or 5 years at a time, getting $250,000 salaries, being called Pashto linguists, because it's a very hard language to find. And so I've seen that kind of stuff that shouldn't be, vehicles that would be billed out for $500,000 that couldn't run, So we wasted a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer dollars, a lot of treasures. A lot of that money could have come back here and built up America's hinterlands and poor white, poor black, poor Hispanic, whatever poor neighborhoods. And we could have done that, but we didn't. And we didn't do our due diligence in Afghanistan. It's not that we failed. It's that we failed to be diligent and we be accountable to our nation. And that is what you have seen in the last few years. Americans complain about the wasteful spending. It was quite a swift decision, shockingly to me, from this administration to bring everybody home immediately. I thought the reduction of forces by 95% was a shock in itself. To go from 100 to 0 is an extreme shock. Think about a person on life support machine and then taking that person off life support machine. You have to slowly do that, right, to get someone out of the ICU. But I'm not going to question our elected officials' decisions. I'm not in that position, and I vote with my ballot. So that's the way I do things. But I think the 2,500 that was left was quite sustainable to help us get to those 3 negotiating points that we wanted, which was the peace process, to the Taliban to renounce affiliations and support to terrorists should they join the government, and then to make sure that the progresses we had made in Afghanistan, not just the territorial gains, the fact that 1 generation of Afghans grew up under freedom, right? 1 generation of Afghans speak English probably better than some of us. The grammar's amazing. That progress cannot be undone. And unfortunately, now they are standing as the barbarians are at the gateway, right? So the troop level of 2,500 that was remaining was almost 1/5 of the troop level that we currently have in Saudi Arabia. And if we say Saudi Arabia is an unstable regime, then we get into some major problems, right? So I think the juice was worth the squeeze to potentially keep anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 special force operators to go after those terrorists, to go after anybody who's trying to, assassinate Ashraf Ghani, right? Like we have to do certain things with our partners to protect them, and to provide logistics. In the papers last week, the Taliban, they're very smart. They're going after pilots. They're killing off pilots in the Afghan military. And if you kill the pilots in the Afghan military, who's going to fly the aircraft that's going to drop the bomb? right? Who's going to fly the logistics aircraft to get supplies to the soldiers? And we saw the video on CNN, the Afghan Qatay Khas, that's Afghanistan's pride and joy. They're the special commandos. They don't belong to any tribal or anything. They are these young, amazing guys who are so nationalistic, and 100 of them ran out of bullets because of logistics, right? Tacticians talk, logistics are the main things when you talk about war, not tactics. And they gave up, they surrendered. And the Taliban just shot them, just completely brutally shot prisoners of war. And it was a good message to the Afghan people. We're killing them and we're coming for your wives and children. It just ripped out the Afghan sort of heart, the spirit, right? Amazing. The Taliban are amazing warriors, right? And we could have played a supportive role, not necessarily a combat role, for many more years to come. And maybe the American populace was not happy, and we wanted to stop that, to go, to say we don't want anything. But I want to just say something. I'm not a political person. I've never had a political office, and when I worked in the White House, I was a detailee. But with all the rhetoric of the last administration, the last administration did not order the troop drawdown to zero, because someone was listening and someone was rational, And having said that, I think there are some serious dangers between now and potentially the next 36 months if we don't take certain actions. And I'm going to take you back, and I've cut my remarks tremendously short so that I make sure my other colleagues get to speak as well. But it is worth remembering the era of the Cold War and when the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, and how the surviving regime there survived. That regime was a stellar regime. It was a powerful regime. Okay, they had 200,000 hard-nosed national security forces, police, and army who knew that if they give up, the Mujahideen are going to rip their throats out. Nobody took over Kandahar for 3 years. Okay, nobody took over Herat for 3 years. Nobody took over Jalalabad for 3 years. Nobody took over any of the insurgencies that happened in Afghanistan from 89 to 92. What happened was the Soviet Union and the United States agreed on something called negative symmetry. We won't support the Mujahideen, and you won't support the Najib government. The Soviet Union stopped providing oil, rice, milk, water, bullets to the Najib regime. And so the population turned against them. The army was scared. They started making side deals, and the regime crumbled from inside. That is my fear for today. We are not there. We need to prevent the Najib regime crumbling today. We need to make sure that somehow the coalition supports this regime that's there, this administration that's there, and it supports a political solution there as well now, right? And so I think what we are seeing is, a discussion today in America that I think is useless. There's no discussion that is useful to say who is to blame for Afghanistan. There are so many hands that touch this that I don't know who to blame, who is to blame. In 2003, I gave a talk at Fort Bragg, and I said, the poppy fields need to be burned, scorch, burn those things, don't let them go. And I got yanked off the stage by someone saying, that is not the United States policy. Whatever he said is not right. That was right. But we didn't want to have that confrontation with the Taliban, but that was their cash crop. That was what they were paying their soldiers with, right? And so there are so many hands. But what I want to say is, what happens when Al-Qaeda, when ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, when the Pakistani Taliban, right? When the terrorists that go into India, when the terrorists that are affiliated with the Middle East that my colleagues talked about have a nest in Afghanistan again, who do we blame for that? That is where we need to talk about, and we need to be prepared to talk about that, right? And the major problem here is we have a lowered footprint, and what does that mean on intelligence collection, right? Our own intelligence community has now joined a course of predictions. All of a sudden, an epiphany happens that, oh, the Afghan government is going to collapse within a year or within 2 years and so forth. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, oh, this is not Vietnam, sir. It's very different than Vietnam when he went on the Hill. And then a couple of days ago, he said, oh, this is really unnerving. Like, I don't know what's going on. Really? I mean, this is the United States of America. This is not some mom and pop shop with a little Intel shop in their basement. This is quite embarrassing. Okay, we need to be doing this a little bit better, right? How are we organized? I mean, we worked in the White House. We saw this stuff. These guys are working in the White House and in the Pentagon. They see this stuff. They need to be a little bit more meticulous. Terrorists don't use email. So if you think you're going to get them through signals traffic or electronics traffic or any of that GPS goody stuff that you have in space, right? That's my area now. That's not going to happen. How do we catch bin Laden? Human carriers, right? This new war that we're in and with the terrorism is going to be a taxing war. And by us reducing our footprint in the region, we're going to depend on intelligence methods and collections ways that does not work with this adversary. And I understand China's the bigger threat, but you know what? China's not coming over here and blowing up our buildings or killing our Americans, overseas. They are hacking into systems and stuff like that. But, I'm more concerned about what happens to my city, what happens to my daughter's school, what happens when my daughter goes on a field trip overseas somewhere. That's what I'm concerned about, right? So to me, this is almost a repeat of 2012 Iraq, right? And the question is the Afghan government up for the fight? Are we going to be the Soviet Union of the 1989, 1992 era with the Afghan regime, right? And the problem for Afghanistan is, we experience social distancing. Afghanistan would love to have social distancing with its neighbors, right? It does not live in a progressive neighborhood. 5 of its almost immediate neighbors are nuclear capable. 3 of them are its immediate neighbors: China, Pakistan, Iran. It is wedged between a state sponsor of violent jihadi terrorism, Iran, and what you would call a failed state, Pakistan, which has millions of potential violent terrorists. And Iran and Pakistan are both the de facto leaders of violent Sunni and Shia jihadi terrorism throughout the world, right? And also Afghanistan has rare earth minerals that China and the US are competing around the world for. And Russia now has a buffer zone with all these other locations and, its reemergence and revisionist history that it wants to do. So to me, our decision-making in the last weeks and months has not been very good. In my opinion, and this is me, I think it just shows how feeble we were in our decision-making on this one. We accomplished nothing. No ceasefire, no political agreements, no military arrangements to mitigate the onset of mayhem and civil war. Instead, a beautifully executed stealthy departure under the cover of darkness. And you saw the stories about that, right? It really is, as the generals described, and I was there, an inflection point, but an inflection point that is not pointing to anywhere towards success, right? And worse for the Afghans was that the White House came out and said, oh, the British went into Afghanistan, they didn't succeed. The Soviets went into Afghanistan, they didn't succeed. Who says we would succeed? The comparison of United States of America, we have our flaws. We have so many flaws, but you know what? Every day we strive for a more perfect union, and we are a strategic leader on every front around the world. No other country compares to us. Comparing us to colonial Britain, right? Comparing us to the communists, the Soviets, are you kidding me? The American occupation was not an American occupation. It was 54 multinational countries, plus the United Nations, the European Union, and NATO in Afghanistan, okay? And you cannot compare that equivocally with those other instances in history. Those people went there and raped and pillaged. Did we have mistakes? Yes. Did we bring those soldiers home and Marines and SEALs and made them account for it? Yes. Did the colonial Brits even care about that? Did the Soviets care about that? Right? They had butterfly bombs that they would drop in Afghanistan so little kids would pick it so their hands would be maimed. Right? This is a different discussion. They bayoneted Afghan women. How many stories of that do you see other than a few instances of one of our soldiers getting PTSD and doing something erratic? This is utterly a falsehood. I, as a person who is in uniform, that was in uniform, as an American, I'm deeply offended by that. And I would say that, when you think about what Afghanistan meant to our, what we meant for Afghanistan, right? After 9/11, there was an email that went out by Tamim Ansari, famous Afghan American writer who, came to America in the 1950s. And he said, when you think about the Taliban, think of Nazis, okay? And when you think about Afghans, think of the Jews. You know, these guys, the Taliban, they hung and lynched TVs. They killed women in stadiums because they wanted to read, okay? They lied about Islamic teachings. They taught people exactly what Wayne was talking about, that Jews are evil. When the Prophet Muhammad himself was married to a Jew, when the three Jewish tribes of Medina welcomed him, of course they don't tell him that. That's not what the Wahhabi schools and the Deobandi schools, the 5,000 of them laced across Afghanistan, Pakistan, they never taught that. So this is what we're talking about. The Americans came as liberators to Afghanistan. It was like going into Nazi Germany. Little boys, if you don't believe me, go into YouTube and look at the videos. Little boys dancing. For the first time, music was allowed. People hiding their paintings, you know. The Buddha statues were blown up. The Americans came in as liberators, and the Afghan people were welcoming them. The Taliban families didn't welcome them, but the majority of the Afghans welcomed the Americans. And it was a valiant cause. And we see that stuff there right now. We see the Afghan Khateh-Khas, the commandos. We see the young women. We see these SIV, special immigrant visa people that we promised to bring to America that we've still left stranded there, right? Promises made, promises kept. That's what we need to be doing. We see all those people that work with us. And you know what? The American legacy in Afghanistan is not the same legacy as the Soviet Union or of that colonial Britain. And I'll tell you that from someone who speaks with Afghans every day over there. And so I think that is an important thing. So I'll close with Charlie Wilson's quote as we started, right? I actually worked on the movie with Tom Hanks and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Mike Nichols. And Mike Nichols, for what it's worth, was a liberal, but he was an extreme patriot. There was a line in the movie that I told him, I said, this will get our American soldiers killed. Please delete it. And he did. And so for all that, he says, when he describes the American support to the Mujahideen, he says, these things happened. They were glorious and they changed the world, but then we effed the end game. And I would say we have unleashed another great game in this end game. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I think, again, in the interest of time, I have to move on to our commentators. Dr. Nick Russo, again, who worked with us for many years, and he will comment on the Middle East topics and related regional, inter-regional issues. And following him, Dr. Ford Rowan, again, who spoke at our events this year and last year, will also be able to make some comments on the presenters. So I would like to really move on that so we can begin with the discussion, the Q&A. Nick?
Thank you, Yona, and thank you, Don, and thank you, everybody. And Ambassador Fierstein, could you put the map back up, please, or who's ever running this? I think the map is really important. I'm going to speak very, very briefly because we've heard a lot, and I think it's important for the audience to be able to participate to some extent. But I'd like to make a few points about the context revealed by this map. One is that it's really not an arc of instability. It's an arc of violence and, to some extent, chaos. And one of the most important parts of that arc is on the left, if you're looking at the map, which is the Colombia-Venezuela FARC connection. In my legal work, we have a case against the FARC on behalf of a victim of narco-terrorism, but the scale of the FARC's activities controls 70% of the world's cocaine traffic. The dominance of so many governments in the region the connections to the Middle East it has through Hezbollah and other organizations, its ability to generate revenue on a scale that's dwarfs most countries' GDP, means that this arc, this global, almost global reach, has unlimited funding for these folks. That's just one point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make picks up on the one that Dr. Sadat just made in his heartfelt plea about Afghanistan. And that is that the United States, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, never defined what its goals were in any realistic way or any precise way. So when it went into Afghanistan, it did not say our goal is to get Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar and send the message, don't you ever do this again, or there'll be even more hell to pay. No, we went in with virtually unlimited resources. And as one former ambassador to Afghanistan said, when you have unlimited resources, you think you can fix every broken window. That's not, those aren't goals, those aren't strategies, that's nothing, that's waste. In Iraq, it was much the same. And one of the goals of strategy, one of the purposes, is to match up ends, ways, and means, as they teach in military academies. And for 20 years, I would say, we have utterly and completely failed to do that. And we need to do that now, or we're going to continue on a course of that's going to lead to more retreat and more disappointment, because the American people will not have had explained to them what our interests are, what our goals are, and what the realistic means for achieving those goals are. And so that's, I'm afraid I'm have to be on the more pessimistic side of things. And one area that it's not Middle Eastern, but I raise it here because I think it's illustrative of the problem, is that the Congress and the people of the United States have not been forced to confront and consider, what do we do if China were to use force against Taiwan? Nothing? We react on the spot? What's the state of the Navy? Et cetera, et cetera. There's just been no conversation about this. And so if China were to do it, the country would be totally unprepared. If there is another terrorist attack like 9/11 that emanates from Afghanistan, I know there will be calls to use nuclear weapons on Afghanistan. And just from people who are just enraged. And that's one of the consequences of not thinking things through and not really taking a strategic view and a realistic view. And so when Dr. Sadat said that we went into Afghanistan without doing a proper appreciation of the place, he's absolutely right. And the same went into Iraq. I think what we should, the message this program should pass on is a desperate need to think long and hard about what it is we're trying to achieve in places and how do we go about doing it in the most cost-effective way. And one of the things that is cost-effective, in my view, is to work with partners and allies to strengthen local capabilities, create local capabilities to fight the 8 QIMs, the Al-Shabaabs of this world, the Taliban. But you don't desert them. You don't sort of say, well, we've done it for 10 years and now we're cutting off the pipeline. That just leads you nowhere. So I'll end there, but I think this has been a very useful conversation. I thank you all for including me.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your insights. We would like to invite Ford Rowan for his comments.
Thank you very much, Yona. I really appreciated what I heard this afternoon. Very helpful to understanding the situation in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. It's hard to feel upbeat about this. Dr. Zaveman's comment on the impact of the Iranian Shia religion, its willingness to die for Allah. Dr. Pollack's comments about the very remote chance of agreement between Israel and Hamas. And Dr. Sadat's insights about his family's homeland and about regarding U.S. withdrawals, we accomplished nothing, a direct quote. And additionally, Ambassador Feuerstein's closing comments on the impact of the pandemic and climate change and the economic threats. So to try to just fill in a little bit about what I heard in a different context, I'd like to talk about the psychological, religious, and economic threats that are in addition to those things that were brought out in today's conversation, which I think was very useful today. But I just want to supplement it. First of all, we have people on the committee that I'm on at the International Dialogue Initiative, which looks for ways to analyze and overcome the psychological barriers to peace. We have people who have spent, we have two people who have spent time in Iranian prisons and now are free living in Europe. And we have two people from, actually four people from Israel, evenly divided between Israelis and Palestinians. And we have people that have served in the US military in Afghanistan. So I'm going to try to fill in something that I've learned, and that is that you have to look beyond just today's anger and hostility and hatred and look at where did it come from and why are there such psychological barriers to peacemaking. And part of it is the transgenerational transmission of trauma. That people have been traumatized and re-traumatized by the telling of the stories of the past, which seem to get more and more vicious and violent as the retelling goes on. And trying to overcome that is enormously difficult. In terms of the economic problems, this is a global economy, and there are economic threats that we overlook in this regard. For example, there's growing investment in the United States in ESG, environmental, social, and governance accountability. And these ESG accounts now total $1 trillion in the sustainable investment market, according to Bloomberg Intelligence. $1 trillion, and it's going to grow in the next dozen years to about $11 trillion, according to their projections. Now, I don't know if it's right or not, but what I'm trying to say is we better look at this not just from the kind of very important things that were discussed earlier, and think about the economic consequences regarding social justice, climate change, and the social justice issues of racism around the world, which was amply pointed out in the earlier discussions. You know, you think we have a racial problem here? We certainly do, but it's endemic around the world. These issues are not the ones that are usually talked about when we get in these kind of conversations. And I only bring it up not to be critical, but rather to say it's a larger context when we have to think about the psychological impact of this, not just on us, but on the children that are going to grow up under all of this. And I really appreciated Dr. Sadat's comments about his homeland and about the attitudes of people and the other underlying comments in several of the commentaries and several of the reports about the atrocities that have happened. It's not an easy thing to get past, but it's worth thinking about because what we're doing right now doesn't seem to be successful. And some of the other alternatives would be useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ford. What I would like to do is to invite our speakers to engage in the discussion before we open it up for Q&A with the attendees. So Ambassador Jerry Parsons, would you like to make some comments now?
Thanks, Yona. You know, there's certainly a lot to discuss. You know, and fundamentally, I would come back to my basic point and say that the jury is certainly out in terms of what direction the region is going to go through, and to pick up on Mr. Rowan's comments at the end, you know, certainly, you know, these broader issues, the economic, the you know, what I call the cross-cutting issues, environment, climate, demography, food security, all of these issues are going to be huge challenges for the region going forward, and they're going to be huge challenges for American policy. I think that, you know, certainly where we are right now in terms of trying to reduce tensions, to get back into a process of negotiation, you know, and certainly, and I do want to you know, comment on one thing. The Biden administration is certainly supportive of the Abraham Accords, and I think perhaps David can speak about that more broadly. But you know, it's something that we're going to have to confront, and you know, and to try to work through some of these complicated issues. I do agree with Dr. Sadat that I would have preferred, if I were in the administration, that we would have continued our, you know, our support for the Afghan military to help it move forward. On the other hand, I do understand the position of the Biden administration, which is 20 years on. You know, it's time that the Afghan people stood up and decided for themselves where they want to go, and not, you know, simply wait for the United States to provide, you know, these solutions for them. So, you know, these are all extremely complicated issues. There's no easy answers to them. I think that it's right to try to work through these things diplomatically, which is the long term, the only way that it's going to be sustained. And I think that we need to start thinking about some of these long term issues, and you know, and not simply focus on the immediate problems in front of us.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. We'll move on to David Pollock.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very, very rich discussion, and I really appreciate it. I want to just comment on Afghanistan in relation to other countries and conflicts in the region in which the United States is involved. And I agree completely that we are making a mistake in confusing a gigantic American military and economic and wasteful, as you said, presence in Afghanistan on the one hand, with a very limited continuing security commitment on the other hand. And we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, in a way that is, I think, a tragic mistake. The only silver lining that I can see is that the withdrawal from Afghanistan may help convince this administration that we can't just withdraw from every place all at once and pull all of our troops out of Iraq and Syria at the same time. And so it may be that, and I hope this is the case, that we will end up, at least in those two other countries, maintaining a very small but very important military footprint in cooperation with our local allies, and not simply just pack up and leave them flat. At the same time, look, I want to just say that we're, you know, when I was in graduate school, I learned about very long-term cycles in American history and foreign policy. I think one name for them was the Kondratiev cycle, 20 years alternating cycles of inward-looking and outward-looking American policy, interventionism and isolationism. And I think we're just up against a gigantic tidal wave right now of reaction against the 20 previous years of major American commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern countries and elsewhere in the world. And a tendency, a very strong tendency in both of our major political parties and in the media and in Congress and in American public opinion to say, the heck with all that. We're just going to concentrate on our own problems here at home and turn inward. So all of us who are interested in, I don't know how to put it exactly, fine-tuning that wave may be the best that we can do, or but we need to think really hard about what arguments to present to people who are not interested, or if they are not convinced that any of these foreign commitments are really that relevant or that worthwhile. We need to convince them that a short-sighted reaction against the previous 20 years is not going to be good for the United States, just the way it was after World War I, or just the way it was after Vietnam, or just the way it was, or just the way it could well be today. We might end up paying a much higher price for it somewhere later down the road if we just maintain a modest, steady commitment now. I think it would much better serve our friends and ourselves.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. We'll move on now to Wayne. Any comments related to Afghanistan and the Iranian plans and so on? Okay, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd just like to add a few things about the Israeli-Palestinian issue to David's great performance in his speech. I appreciate everything he said. One of the questions I have is the prelude to the current Gaza-Israel war. There was an announcement of elections, that there was going to be elections between Fatah and Hamas, and then it was canceled because presumably Fatah knew that they would lose to Hamas if they did it. So even though Hamas may not be all that popular now, it seems like Fatah and Abbas are even less popular.
That's true. I agree. Yeah.
Then the other thing is, what in the current situation has changed that would indicate that there's any possibility? You have Hamas and Fatah, neither one trusts each other, or believes in each other's objectives. Who do you deal with? I mean, who does the United States deal with? Do they deal with Hamas? Do they deal with Fatah? What's the solution to that? The other question I have is, historically, Arafat and the Fatah were in Tunisia, and they were basically became irrelevant because they didn't have borders with Israel. So with the Oslo Accords, Israel brought them, and the United States brought them back, set them up in the territories. Excuse me, and as a result, it became what Arafat termed the treaty, like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is that we'll wait, as soon as we get stronger and more powerful, get public opinion on our side through diplomacy and through military might, we'll abrogate this. So it seems like we're doing the same thing now with the Palestinians, because under the Trump administration, he basically had made the Palestinians irrelevant in the sense that they can't do a veto on any kind of normalization agreement between Israel and the Arab nations. So, and he stopped funding them. And it seems to me that that worked. It seems like there was a positive effect. Once they saw that we were funding them again, and we were going to open a consulate for them, and we were going to support them, and that we were beating up on Israel again, then all of a sudden, the trouble came. It didn't seem like it was going to solve anything. It seems like the definition of insanity is to keep trying the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Every time we've tried to mediate an agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis, it ends up failing. It ends up with another intifada, even more violent than the previous one, and it depletes the United States prestige in the world. So I just don't. I'm not optimistic at all about what the Biden administration is trying to do now. Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, just really briefly, I understand a lot of those points, and yet I would say two things. As far as Hamas is concerned, I agree with you. I don't think there's any prospect of anything more than, at best, a long-term ceasefire with Hamas. They are not moderates. They are not going to be moderates. They're not going to accept peace with Israel, and unfortunately, that's the reality. But the PA under Abbas or his potential successors is a different story. There hasn't been an intifada under Abbas and the way there was under Arafat, and I don't think there will be. And in fact, there's actually, under the surface, despite all the rhetoric and the tensions and the real issues of occupation and of terrorism that continue, that there is a lot of cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel on security and economic and other issues. And so that's number one. Number two is that whatever else we might or might not try to do, the Palestinians aren't going away, and there are millions of Palestinians who are an issue for Israel and for therefore indirectly for us and for neighboring countries. It is true, I agree with you, that this is not the central issue of the region anymore, if it ever was. But it is an issue, and it cannot be indefinitely just pushed, I think, into a corner. It has repercussions inside Israel and for other neighboring countries and for the United States in terms of our own values and our credibility and our alliances. And so just trying to imagine a future in which there's no hope at all for the Palestinians is one that I think does not serve our interests or Israel's interests.
So it is endless.
Well, it's not literally endless, but it's a continuing story. I do not see, as I said, and in this too, I agree with I think the thrust of some of what you were saying, Wayne, that I do not see a final status solution on the horizon that will bring real peace for some of the reasons that you said and some of the ones that I said. But I do think it's important to try and improve the situation on the ground and keep the door open for peace someday. And the long-term trend on the Arab-Israeli conflict is actually a positive one. Peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, peace with other Arab countries, agreements with the Palestinians, very far short of real peace, but still agreements with the Palestinians. This is a conflict that, you know, even 40 years ago, people thought was absolutely intractable, and it's not. It's not intractable. It's very difficult, and it's very, let's say, slow to heal, but the long-term trajectory is actually a positive one.
If I could just interject something, Yona.
Yes, sure.
This, David's comment has reminded me of an episode when I worked at the U.S. mission to the UN, where James A. Baker III, Special Representative of the Secretary General for the Western Sahara, presented the Security Council with essentially his plan for bringing that conflict between Morocco and Algiers to an end. And he ran into the then Irish ambassador to the UN, who looked as if he stepped straight out of central casting. He was quite wonderful that day, not on every day. He referred to the Palestinians blowing up families having seders in 2002, and Israel it's not terrorism, it's resistance to occupation. It's Irish showing. But he said to Baker, he said, look, yeah, it costs $500 million a year to the UN to keep peacekeepers in the Western Sahara and work these issues. But there are issues where you just have to work it. And if it costs $500 million a year to prevent people from fighting, as it was the case in the Western Sahara at that time, it's worth doing. It's not a happy solution, but it's not the worst solution. And Baker walked out of the room and promptly resigned. I mean, he knew he'd been beaten. And in a way, the Arab-Israeli conflict is one you have to work. And the trouble with the response to the frustrations and expenditures and waste and fecklessness in Afghanistan and Iraq is walking away is not a solution. Just as doing nothing in the face of the Syrian humanitarian catastrophe was not a solution. And so, but I completely agree that we've had both of the major parties are, big chunks of them are in an isolationist mood, and I don't quite know how to get past it, but we just have to keep working it, that's all. Yeah. Thank you.
Very interesting. The clock is ticking, and I want to turn it over to Professor Don Wallace. But before I do, just to mention, David, that when I began to deal with this particular issue, I also mentioned, I recall that back in the year 2000, October 12, 2000, we organized also through the ILI an event on the Middle East peace process, QUO VADIS, at the time. And I had Ambassador Philip Wilcox from the State Department, that I guess you know.
Yes, sure.
Who is and all that.
Sure.
The counterterrorism, and our colleague and friend John Alterman. At that time, he was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Professor Don Peretz, going all the way back. He was a professor at the State University of New York, Binghamton, and he wrote on the refugees and all that. So this was 20 years ago. So the bottom line question to you, are we going to meet in next 20 years again to talk about the Middle East peace process, Quo Vadis?
Yeah, probably.
Well, maybe you will, but
I found a book review that Richard Shifter had written of Jimmy Carter's book, Peace, Not Apartheid, and it is incredibly relevant today, and it was published in 2007, so why not?
Okay, well, maybe Professor Wallace will be more optimistic, or are we expecting little?
Well, I am a Pollyanna, but this has been an overwhelmingly factual panels. Gloom and doom. I think gloom is probably justified. Doom is never justified. I do think that the decision in Afghanistan seems mistaken, but putting that to one side, there's a note of hope and optimism. I mean, Nick is quite right. You just have to keep on working things. That's the American faith. Be practical, can do. I think one thing that's been forgotten is that to some extent, the Biden administration is working itself out of a hole. I think the last 4 years were not exemplary, and David has suggested the last 20 haven't been perfect. So the extent that they're realists and have some optimism, you've got to bear that in mind. Secondly, I think China does loom awfully large in the minds of many Americans. And while it shouldn't screw us up and intellectually, paralyze us, I think it is a problem. And I'll put to one side details like climate change. So I think I cannot agree with Wayne on Iran at all, because that to me is the example of how not to approach things with all respect. To just endlessly state the problems, and I don't dispute the reality of them, and then say, oi, that cannot be the approach. You've got to be a bit of a Pollyanna. You've got to be like Nick. You've got to work things along. As for 20 years from now, Yona, I would suggest you have to have a perfect diet and do a great deal of exercise every day, so that you can be with us then. I think we should keep coming back to this, but not in 20 years. We should do this every year or two. And see what happens. I do think that one of the great strengths of America has been our optimism. And it's not an optimism which is not, it's rooted in reality. We are both realists and optimists at our best. And I think we just have to keep that attitude. And it's, I think someone suggested it was probably mere. What's the alternative to the US? There is no alternative, with all respect to my wife is British, and I don't entirely accept Mir's characterization of the United Kingdom. There's a lot of truth in it, by the way, don't worry. But I agree, we should not compare ourselves to them, but to all these other people. And I don't think we do. And I think we have to congratulate Yona. Yona was my client. And I've known Yona for a long time. And in the face of all sorts of annoyances and frustrations, Yona never gives up. And I don't think we should either. And I don't think we will. So Yona, I think you're to be congratulated, and keep up the work and keep pulling us together. And I think Ambassador Firestein probably captured the sort of the right mix, the negatives and their positives, focus, keep your eye on the, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. I think we just have to, it's sort of an attitudinal thing, as Ford was suggesting, and I think we just have to keep at it. Anyway, so Yona, thank you very much. And we want to thank Bob Sargent. I wouldn't call it, he works for us. I wouldn't call him selfless, but he's hardworking. So thanks, Bob.
So to express our gratitude to the speakers, commentators, and the audience, and let's hope and pray that tomorrow will bring more, I think, optimism and practical approaches to resolve some of these issues. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.